Hey class, in this video we'll be going over user interface design, and we're going to start by creating some user interface elements in Pascal. So we'll create some buttons with different states and some titles for the different scenes like the menu, some instructions, and a game over and a win game scene. We have a lot to cover in this one, so we'll learn how to lay them out in Godot in the next lab. So in here, we'll just be working in Pascal, doing the design. In the following lab, in user interface layout, we'll set up the actual layout in Godot. So we'll just design our elements, and then we're gonna have to export them in a slightly different way. So I'll go over that, and then we'll post them on the Open Lab. So let's get started. So before we make the art for our user interface, let's talk about what we mean by user interface or UI. So we're gonna look at a few screens from Super Mario. Here's the start menu screen that will show when you load up the game. And you can see there's a few elements of our user interface here. There's the logo for the game, which is kind of the main part of this scene. There's also some graphics from the actual game down here, which gives us a little preview of what the game looks like. And then there's two buttons for a 1-player and a 2-player game. And so this is a functionality that allows the player to choose which type of game that they want to play. We'll make graphics for all of these things. We're going to be making buttons that interact with the mouse. You could also create buttons that interact with key presses. If that's something you're interested in implementing, we could talk about how to do that. In the next screenshot, we see a in-between scene between the start menu and when you start the first level. And that gives you some information, the level that we're on, and the number of lives we have. If we look at this final screenshot of actual in-game play, you can see the user interface elements at the top that tell us information about what's happening in the game. These stay in the top of the screen as you're playing, so they don't move at all. And in the metrics lab, we'll go over how to add those user interface elements into the game. So we'll make some buttons, we'll make the titles, and we'll also include some graphics on the start menu scene. So that's mainly what we'll be working on. We're also gonna make a scene for the instructions where we'll show how to play the game. So that'll just be a very simple drawing. So I'm gonna start with the titles, and these are things like the name of the game that goes in the start menu or the instructions page. So I'm gonna make my canvas a little bit bigger. I'm gonna do 256 by 256, and I'm gonna go ahead and save this as UI titles. And so if I change the name of my game later or want to adjust some things, I can always come back and just change these graphics instead of starting from scratch. And so I'll save that. And then I'm going to set up my grid here because I'm going to be drawing some text. And so this will make it easier for me to draw text that kind of lines up and is more legible. And so I'm just going to write my game here. Obviously, this is just a generic name. You should come up with your own name for your game. If you change the name later, that's fine. But come up with something now that kind of captures what you're going for with the game. And I'm also using white to draw my text. And that's because it'll make it easier to change the color in Godot. If I used black, then it would always be black, the way that Godot blends colors. But with white, I can blend it into any other color I want. So I'm going to center this and then move it up a little bit. I have kind of an idea of a simple layout. We can always change that later, so don't worry if the layout isn't exactly perfect the first time. So I want to add some graphics as well. So my start menu is not just some text, and I can use the import function. So if I click on import and go to browse images, I can actually go find a sprite that I've already created and import the images into the project that I'm working on. It's a sprite sheet, so I have to set it up to get the images correctly. And if you mess this up, it's not a big deal. You can just erase the stuff that you don't want, but this way it'll import each one of my sprites into a new frame. And so I'm just gonna take one of those. So I'll grab one frame from the characters I just imported and put that onto my title. So I'll delete the other frames that I don't want. And so it imported it onto a different frame. So I'm going to select the area with the art and copy and then paste that into my first frame so I can lay it out with the game text that I have. And so let's add a few other elements for the game so we can kind of reuse the graphics that we already created to create our title scene. So I'll go and find one of my obstacle scenes. I'll get my snake that I created for the obstacle. And I'm just going to go through the same process. So I'm going to tell it how many frames to import. And since there's 3 frames to this animation, I'll just go ahead and use each of those frames separately as though they're different snakes. And so that will add a little bit to what is in that scene. So again, I'll use the selection tool to copy the snake from one frame and paste it into the next. And then I'll repeat that with my other frames. And then the last thing I'll add in here, I'll just go in and grab one of my rewards. So I'll use the apple item that I created, and I can do something similar. I'll just import each one of the frames, and then I will separate them and then add them in as though they're different items. So just to add a little bit of variety to the scene. And again, they're all on different frames. So I'll just go through and copy and paste using the selection tool to get each one onto my first frame. So then I'll go to the next frame and create a title for my instructions page. So I'm just going to draw some keys from the keyboard that are used to play the game to give the player just some basic instructions about how to play. So I'll write instructions here at the top in sort of a similar style to my game title. And it's kind of a long word, so it's going to be a little bit hard to fit in here. So I'm just going to try that again. And again, I'm using the grid to keep my text sort of in a line. So I like the kind of rough hand-drawn style, but in order to be legible, I do want to make sure that it kind of reads across a line. And I almost ran out of space there, but that looks pretty good. So now I'm just going to draw the keys from the keyboard that the player can use to do different things in the game. So my jumping is done with the X key, and then the movement is done with the arrow keys. And so my game is pretty simple. I'm not doing a lot else. You might have to add more in here, so you might need a bigger layout. But I'm just going to use my grid as kind of a basis for creating the keys. And then I can move them around a little bit. And once I have my keys set up, I'll just label them. So I'm going to put jump over here under the X. Again, using these grid lines to kind of keep things looking pretty nice. And that looks pretty good. I could play around with that more, but that's good enough for the demo. And so let's go on to our next title. This is just when the player wins the game. I'm not going to do anything too fancy here. I'm just going to write you win and fill it in. And again, I'm just using white text, so I can change the color in Godot if I want to. So I'm just outlining these letters to make them a little bit bigger, and then I'll fill them in with my paint bucket. And the last title I have to do is the game over. So this obviously will show up if the player dies or loses the game. And it may be accompanied with some buttons to start over or quit the game. And so I'll be able to put those together in my Godot layout. I'm going to do something similar to the you win. I'm just going to make game over on 2 lines, again, using my grid as a way to keep things nice and straight and legible. So the last thing I'm going to do here is separate the graphics and the game from my first title. I don't know that I'll actually need to do this, but I might want to have the title of the game and other scenes, like maybe I'll have it on the instructions page or something like that. I'm not really sure that I will do that, but just to give the option, I'm going to separate the title of the game from those graphics, and then I'll put them together in Godot later. Now we will design a button to use. And what I'm going to start with is a button template. And so what I'm going to do is just create a simple button without any text on it. And so it could be used for any type of button. And then I'll duplicate that art and save it as a few different buttons. So I need a few things for now in the game. I need a start button and a quit button. And I need the instructions button to go to the instructions page. And I need a start over if you die. And I think that's everything that I'll need. I can always make more buttons later if I need to. So again, I'll start with a little guide to make it easier to draw a shape. And so I'll start with this kind of rectangle, and then I'll draw something a little more rough around it. You could try something like adding shading to the button to make it look kind of 3D. I tried this out, I didn't love it, so I didn't keep it in here, but it looks kind of cool. And you could probably do a good job of this if you spent a little bit more time than I did. Ultimately, what I want with my button is 3 different states. So what it looks like when it's just there, when you first start the game. And then if you mouse over it, it should react in some way. Like if you're using a website, usually if you hover over one of the buttons or links, the color might change or something else might change so that you know you can click on it. And then we need another state for when we do click on the button, it should change in some way. So that's 3 total states, which we could call idle, hover, and active. And so I'm going to do this very simply. I'm not going to do anything too crazy, but you could try different stuff with your buttons. Once I'm happy with how this looks, I'm just going to duplicate the first frame and then change the background a little bit, or the fill. And then I'll do that one more time to create my 3 different states. You could also do multiple different states to give the designer some more options while they're working. So if you design all the UI, you might want to give them a few different options to work with, so they're not stuck with just 3 different options. One thing I tried here was doing a dithering background. So that looks kind of cool. I can just kind of fill in with the 2 different tones, and it creates this sort of chessboard pattern of the 2 colors. And I can't actually do like a paint bucket there, but I can just kind of fill it in by hand. And so I have my 3 states. I have my button with a transparent background, and then I have the button with a filled in background of the same color. And now I have a button with a sort of dithered background. And that gives me a few different options to play with when I add in the specific buttons, like the start button and stuff like that. So now I want to save my template, and then basically what I'll do for my other buttons is just start with a template and save them as something else, and then do my design and then go back to the template. So here I am working on the start button. You can see I actually forgot to do that, but I'll go back later and fix it. So that's not a big deal. If you forget to, save the new file correctly, which is kind of easy with Pascal, unfortunately, the way it's set up, you can think that you changed the name, but you forgot to do save as, and I've done that a bunch of times. Anyway, I'm still working on the template file, but I can go back and kind of fix things, which I'll do once I'm done with this design. So I'm drawing start inside of the button. I realized later that it's easier to just make a new frame and draw on the new frame with the onion skin. But what I did instead was just use the selection tool to kind of cut out the start and make a couple copies of it. And then I also changed the color so that it would stand out against the white background and the dithered background. And so that gave me a few different states pretty quickly just by having a different color of the start button. This is another place where you might want to use font. Like you could just have a button template and then use different fonts in Godot. And so you don't even have to draw all the different buttons. That would be a pretty reasonable thing to do and is easy enough. And we'll go over how to use font in the metrics lab. But for this one, I kind of like the hand-drawn look. So I'm just going to draw all of my different buttons. So now I'm done with the start button. You can see I added another state. So there's transparent, black, white, and dithered. And that gives my designer a few more options. And then this is the point at which I realized that I had overwritten my button template. So you can see me going through to save the template again just by undoing what I had. And Pascal also saves a lot of local stuff in the browser cache. And so that's another way that you could possibly recover something if you forgot to save it. So once I got all that worked out, I had my button template back. And so I opened the button template again and then save it as instructions. So this is UI button instructions. And then you can see I did save as here. So I did this correctly. And so that's nice because I saved myself some time. So now this time I made a new frame and put it under my first button and then turned on the onion skin. And now I can draw the text of the button and copy and paste it without worrying about overwriting anything. So this is a slightly better approach, but either way, you can work things out. And you can see I didn't have enough space to write instructions, which again is kind of a long word. So I had to try again. And so I just made my pen a little bit smaller and did it again. And so once I managed to get instructions to fit inside of the button area, I just made a few copies of it and then paste it into my different states. So I can paste it into the first frame, and then I need to change the color to paste it into my other frame since the background is white. I need to have black text. And so I can use the paste pixels tool. So now that I'm done with the instructions, I'm going to open up the button template again. And this time I'm going to save it as quit. So UI button quit. And I'm going to make the quit button. So this button will be on the start menu and the game over menu if you want to quit the game. And so I'm going to save that Pascal file and then make a new frame. And I'll just draw the quit text inside of the button using the onion skin. And so this is basically the same process as the previous two. Once I've got the text looking the way I like it, I'll just use a selection tool to copy and paste it into the other frames. And I'll make a few copies so I have that, and also change the color for the buttons with the light background. So the nice thing here is even though my buttons are hand drawn, they're pretty consistent across the different buttons that I have. You could do completely different styles for all of your buttons, or if you want something that's a bit cleaner looking, you could use a font, or you could use some basic shapes that are a little bit more regular. But I kind of like this hand drawn style, so I'll keep working with this. So once I'm done with the quit button, I'll go back to my UI button template, and this time we're going to make the start over button. And so this is a button that will just start the game over if the player dies or loses the game. So I'm going to call that UI button start over and save that file. And then I'm just going to repeat the same process here. So I'm going to make a new frame and then use the onion skin to draw the text inside of the button. Start over is also a bit longer, so it was a little tricky to fit this text inside of the button. And so I followed the exact same process there to get my 4 different button states, and that looks pretty good. So let's go ahead and save that. And so now I've saved all of my different UIs that I need. I've got my titles and all of my buttons, and now I need to export them into a format that can be used in my game. And so as I mentioned in the intro with the UI, we can't really use sprite sheets because we can't change the frame. And so what we need to use instead is a zip folder where we can separate each frame onto a different image. And so Pascal makes that really easy. If we go to the export and then go over to this zip tab, we can add a prefix for the different frames, and then we can download a zip file that has all of those frames in it. And so we can go into our user interface design where we just have our Pascal files and then save a whole folder or zip archive with everything in there. So there's my titles. If I open that up, you can see each one of my titles, and each frame is a separate PNG. So that'll be really easy to use in Godot. The frames have their numbers, so I'm just gonna rename these real quick. So I have my title graphic, I have the instructions, and it's a little hard to see what those are because they're white. I have the you win title, and then finally I have the game over. So I'm gonna rename those to make it a little bit easier to find them in Godot once we use them there. And so now I have to repeat the same process with my buttons. And so I have 4 different buttons, so I'm just going to go through this. So I'm going to start with the instructions button, and I'm just going to do the exact same thing. Go over to the export tab, choose the zip folder, set the prefix. So I'm going to use UI button here, and then download the zip. And so that'll give me the same thing where I have my UI button instructions, and I have each one of my states in there. So it would definitely be nice if we could just include those all on a single sprite sheet. It would make organizing this a little bit easier, but the way the Godot UI is set up, we have to do it this way. And so let's just keep going. So we'll open our next button file. So let's go with the quit button, go to export and choose the zip again, and make sure to add the prefix UI button quit, and then download our zip. And so those button files will just have the number of each frame, but that's good enough. They all say the same thing, and we can see them pretty easily, so we don't need to name each individual frame. So then let's go on to the start over, and we'll set the prefix UI button start over, download a zip there. And then let's go to our last button, which is the first button we created, which is the start button. And we'll do the same process there. Just go to export, export zip, add the prefix, and we're almost done. So we have a bunch of folders with different buttons in them now. So it's a little bit more challenging organization wise, but it's still pretty straightforward. I can also save my template button as images. So that way you could use a font and add whatever text you want. So that would make it really easy to make a whole bunch of different buttons that you don't necessarily have to draw from scratch. So I'll just throw that in there as well in case the designer wants to work with that. And so we can unzip all of these zip archives to get the actual images and folders. And once we take everything out of the archive, let's just grab all of those folders and compress them into one big archive that has everything in there. So now we have our UI buttons and our UI titles as two separate zips. So that'll make it easy to share with someone if you want to collaborate or someone wants to use your user interface designs for their project. So that looks pretty good. Let's go over to the Open Lab and do some documentation. We can create a new post and look for the user interface design category, and then we can give it a title. And you might write a little bit about what you were thinking as far as your design. So you could say how you designed the titles, what graphics you included, maybe how you made the buttons and what the different states look like. And of course, we're going to throw all these images into our post as well. So let's just grab each separate button. We can start with our button template and then add in the buttons as examples. And then we can throw in our titles as well. And so we could use a gallery here that might make it easier to see everything, or you can just drag them in each individually. And it might be useful to label them as well, although it's pretty easy to see what they are. So that might not be totally necessary. You can decide what looks best there. And so that looks pretty good. Let's preview it. And that looks great. So let's go and publish.